If we're trying to think about who would actually been able to read Magna Carta, we need to think about different levels of literacy. The people in the Middle Ages who could actually speak and read Latin fluently were relatively few. But there's a much bigger class beyond them who were able to use writing functionally to achieve social aims. And so this means that actual literacy is spread quite widely in this society. So to take an obvious example, anyone who's involved in trade or business, like the representatives beside me here, would have had to have been able to manage at least some literate techniques, because they would have had to cope with agreements which would have been written down, with accounts perhaps. So this means that actually literacy is fairly widespread. Also, the culture of the church makes a big impact too, because the basics of the Christian religion, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed and so forth, would have been known by the whole population. If you look at King Canute's time, there's legislation then that says that it's actually compulsory for all the population to know this stuff. So this means that although Magna Carta looks a little bit elite, it looks a little bit distant from everyday life. There's a lot of people who would have had some point of access to it, who would have known a few words of Latin to pick a little bit out of it, or who would have been able to have at least a bit of basic literacy with which to comprehend it. Literacy in English and French would have been probably a bit more widespread, because obviously those are the actual mother tongues of most of the people. So in that sense, it provides an easier point of access. Despite that, surviving literature in English and in French is actually much rarer than writing in Latin itself. Latin remains the dominant tongue through the central Middle Ages in terms of what's actually written down. So this then takes us to the question of sort of who really is actually speaking French. And this is something where there seems to be quite marked change over time. Obviously, after the Norman conquest, the ruling class in this country is French speaking. But they probably lose that language fairly fast, because they are being brought up by nursemaids from the village, English speakers. They have to communicate with the servants a lot. So this means that they are coming to speak English, or perhaps pidgin between English and French, as their language. It's probably only at the very highest levels of society, such as the king himself, where French remains the natural and mother tongue well on into the 13th century. Elsewhere, English is gradually seeping into the minds of the descendants of the Normans themselves. Yes, I think that students are genuinely engaged by problems arising from the Middle Ages, and I think this engagement really comes from two directions. First, they're the physical remains of the period. These litter the English countryside. There are churches, there are castles, there are many things which are alien phenomena. They are not something which is part of everyday life necessarily, and so they do prompt curiosity and reflection. Secondly, there are a lot of medieval roots for many of the problems that we can see as being prominent in medieval politics and society. So, just to take an obvious example, the relationship between the peoples of the British Isles is a major controversial topic at the moment, in the aftermath of the Scottish referendum. Much of the kinds of questions which actually are being debated actually go back to the Middle Ages themselves, in the attempt of English kings to dominate Scotland and the other parts of the British Isles. So there are really very strong contemporary resonances for a lot of the kinds of concerns which are quite prominent in scholarship on the Middle Ages. I think the question of political liberty and Magna Carta is not necessarily something which is the prime interest for them. I think that the experience of government, the experience of being ruled by the state, is something which seems to have a much stronger grasp for them. And Magna Carta was a part of that bigger story. Again, we can take that towards people's lives today, because those are obviously prominent themes. But Magna Carta itself is something which is obviously a well-known name, but I think it's something which is most meaningful when viewed as part of a much bigger problem.